Hi everyone, welcome back to Unraveling Politics. If you're a new listener, a little bit about this show. I am a third-year student of political science and public administration at a university in southeastern Pennsylvania, and in this show I discuss the political news of the week and provide my analysis for you. This show is mostly for people who are interested in politics but don't have a great way to learn about it, and really this is a once a week show that where we kind of discuss the big names of the day, the big things of the day. Well, I am back on vacation. I went to Florida. That's why I was unavailable last week. Quite a few things happened while I was away, but before I begin, I am very sorry about an episode that I released on December 13th or December 30th that never made it to YouTube. YouTube has given me a lot of technical issues. I've sorted them out now, so that shouldn't be a problem in the future. But if for some reason it is, I'll let you know. So let's run through some of the things that occurred. On Friday, January 7th, or January 3rd, Mike Johnson was reelected as Speaker of the House on the first ballot. However, there was some tension about whether he appeared to have lost the vote, because he appeared to have lost the vote after the first vote. But then he won in the end because some members switched their votes, and he was elected 218 to 215, and one Republican voted against, and there's one vacancy. I anticipate that Speaker Johnson will not remain as Speaker through the entire term, since the majority is so thin, and there was over a dozen rebels at first, and this is also the narrowest House majority in almost a century. The last time was 1930, and that majority was actually overturned midway through the Congress. I'm not saying I think that's going to happen this time, but that is something to note. As long as Johnson has Trump's backing, he should be fine, but I wonder if they're going to turn on him eventually, and they're definitely going to turn on him after the midterms. However, as many of us know, Trump can change on a whim, so we'll have to wait and see. The next 2 years are going to be very interesting. What does this mean for Trump and his agenda? Well, it appears it's going to be very difficult to get his agenda through Congress, because while they have both chambers, Democrats can still use the filibuster on most bills in the Senate. If you're not aware of what the filibuster is, the filibuster allows the minority party to, when they have at least 40 seats, to continue to extend debate for really infinity. So that's why a lot of projects get stuck in the Senate. They pass the House pretty easily, but they get stuck in the Senate. The only bills that filibusters are not able to be used on is fiscal bills, so that would be government spending bills, as well as bills like, or I guess it wouldn't be a bill, but a Supreme Court and other judiciary nominations. Those were abolished. As I mentioned previously, a government funding bill is due in March, and the debt ceiling will have to be raised, and that's a priority among Republicans, as well as tax cuts and mass deportations, among other things. A note about the debt ceiling is, before I move on, is that Democrats usually always vote for debt ceiling increases. Republicans usually support one when a Republican is president, while more libertarian GOP members might not. But that shouldn't be a problem, because it was like it was a few years ago. When a Democrat is president, like has been the case the last 4 years, that's usually a big problem. All hell breaks loose. If you want more information, check out the 2023 debt ceiling negotiations that took us to about a week from default, and the 2011 debt ceiling negotiations back when Barack Obama was president to just a few days, I believe. Anyway, if you're interested in some of the top items that a Trump administration might pursue in the early days and weeks, check out my previous episode. Tom Homan, the soon-to-be border czar, has hinted that deportations will begin on day one, and that there's supposed to be some sort of hotline for Americans to report suspected criminal migrants. Of course, this is going to require funding from Congress, so I don't see how they're going to get this ready on day one, unless they can do it via executive order and redirect existing funds from elsewhere in the federal budget. We'll have to wait and see. So a week ago, on Monday, Congress confirmed Trump as president. Talked about this a little bit in my previous episode, but I had recorded it so far in advance that it was kind of, I was sure it was going to happen, but the details weren't entirely clear. Now we know it went without a hitch. It was completely different than it was 4 years ago. Nobody objected as far as I know, and if anybody did, it didn't get past that. Some of the left-wing press, like the Daily Beast, they tried to say it might not happen, but if there was no speaker. But as I described last episode, that was not going to happen. There was no chances of Trump not being confirmed. Internationally, Trudeau announced his resignation to resign as prime minister. I talked about this either in the episode before last or the one before that, which I predicted that was going to happen. I predicted he was going to resign. He hasn't resigned yet, but he's very likely to resign in the coming days, and we're in the coming weeks, because he's already announced he would step down as the leader of this party. This would affect us Americans because it leaves Canada in a weaker negotiating position than it would have been, say, a year or 2 years ago. The Liberal Party, who is the governing party for the time being, needs to select a new leader, and that leader will be installed as prime minister. And the reason I say installed is because they can get a new prime minister without an election. For reasons I won't get into, the government is probably going to face an early election this spring, which the Liberals are almost certain to lose, 99.999% chance, and the Conservatives will come in with their leader, and Canada will have another prime minister, who is more likely to be aligned with Trump. However, make no mistake, just because the Conservatives are more aligned with Trump doesn't mean that they're going to do what Trump wants. Their interest is Canadians, while our interests are with Americans. So, just because they're going to get somebody who might be more politically aligned with Trump doesn't mean that, they're going to do whatever Trump wants. This means that for the first half of this year, negotiations with Canada is going to be very difficult and unstable, since their government is going to change twice. If I was Trump, I wouldn't bother attempting to implement tariff negotiations until after their election, which we don't even know when that's going to be. It's probably going to be in May or June. There's no point in negotiating with the Liberals because they don't even have a leader, only for them to be swept out of power in just a few months. It would be a complete waste of his time. The difficulty is, does Trump want to wait until summer? I don't think so. From his statements, it sounds like he wants negotiations to begin on day one or sooner. Speaking of Canada, now Trump has, as I've written in the title, Trump has now floated invading multiple different countries and going to economic war with Canada. In the middle of last week, Trump suggested invading Greenland, saying it's an absolute necessity for our national security, and adding it to the United States, which I would totally support, by the way. Mysteriously, though, I didn't hear him say it should be a state. He also floated taking over the Panama Canal Zone, which we handed over to Panama in 1999. When the Panamanian government said that they were going to stay in control of Panama, or the Panama Canal, there were no ifs, ands, or buts. That's my words, not theirs. Trump posted, "We'll see about that." So, very interesting. He also floated invading Mexico to take control of drug cartels. As for Canada, Trump said he wouldn't invade Canada, probably because Canada is a NATO ally, but instead use economic force to make them join the U.S. And lastly, for good measure, he wants to rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. Needless to say, all of these would be a terrible idea, maybe except annexing Greenland. With the exception of renaming the Gulf, that I guess wouldn't be a big deal because that wouldn't actually change very much. Invading Mexico without their permission would be a huge violation of international law. Invading Greenland, who's under the process of becoming independent, would also be a terrible idea and another violation of international law. A trade war with Canada would also be terrible, as that would both hurt us Americans and Canadians on the other side of the border. And as for me, I support more free trade between Canada and the United States. And while I admit I'd love to see Canada and Greenland join the United States, I don't think that they want that to happen. And if that's not what they want, then I don't think we should force them to. Because of the USMCA and the previous NAFTA trade deals, any deals that we strike with Canada must also be given to Mexico. The Canadians do most of their trade with us, and the USMCA is up for review next year, so we'll have to wait and see for any changes. But we do a lot of trade with Mexico, so Canada would be willing to cut Mexico out and do a bilateral trade agreement, while we might not be so keen because we do, I believe, $100 billion of trade with Mexico, while Canada does way less than that, maybe like 20 or 30 billion. Well, it's in their interest to cut Mexico out. It might not be ours. Anyway, I don't want to get into the weeds too much of this rhetoric, but in my opinion, it's not very serious, and instead it is an attempt to invade or to scare the Mexicans, the Canadians, the Panamanians, and the Greenlanders, I guess that's what you call them, and distract them. The Canadians, they seem to be falling for it, though, and I think that's pretty hilarious. I follow Canadian media who spend a lot of their time focused on us, and they've set their hair on fire about being annexed, including some of their politicians. So they are entirely focused, almost completely, at least until Trudeau stepped down, on what we're doing. Various news outlets reported over the weekend, moving on to another topic, that Trump is planning to sign over 100 executive orders upon taking office next week. This is according to Oklahoma Senator Mark Wayne Mullen, and he has indicated that they will address border security and energy production. Kevin Cramer and John Hennevan, who are North Dakota senators, have said that Trump has thrown out this number as well. I highlighted in the previous episode what I expected some of these to be, but even I was surprised by 100. That's a lot. As I said, I expect the removal of domestic oil and gas production, as well as new border policies and some groundwork for mass deportations, as well as the cutting back of the administrative state. Some of these might be symbolic, but as many of them are. But there's going to be some big changes coming in just a week. Without knowing what they are, I assume it's safe to say that most of these are going to be challenged in court. Since the inauguration is taking place at the Capitol, like always, Republican senators have suggested that Trump come inside afterward and sign them in the Capitol building, as well as his nominees' paperwork to get that done right away. Usually they go back to the White House and sign them later that evening. But yeah, they really, really want to get this done as soon as possible. While not as important, Biden will probably issue his own executive orders within the next week as he prepares to leave office. If there's any important ones, I'll get to those to you next week, but I imagine most of them are going to be symbolic. Next, the TikTok ban. This has been in the news more and more. It's kind of, when it was signed, it was a big deal, but then it kind of slowly died down, and now it's kind of roaring back up again. Because the ban will take effect on January 19th. It was a law signed by President Biden last spring before he dropped out, and January 19th is just 6 days away. Currently, the ban is being challenged at the U.S. Supreme Court and will likely be upheld as both the liberal and conservative justice seems to question TikTok's claims that free speech is being restricted. One of the justices, I believe it was Biden's appointee Ketanji Brown Jackson, said that it didn't make sense that an algorithm is free speech. Theoretically, the court could hand down this decision at any time. At the time of this recording, it has not. I expect the court to uphold the ban, but they could also temporarily block the ban to review the case in more detail. Trump has said he wants to keep TikTok, which is out of character because he was the one that came up with the ban over 5 years ago and tried to do it via executive order. Since this was a law signed by Congress, there really isn't that much Trump can do to overturn it other than possibly refuse to enforce the ban, but that would mean that Apple and Google would need to be willing to let the app remain on their app stores and hope that they don't get sued. There is a get out clause for TikTok, which would require them to sell the app to a U.S. company, and if they choose to do this, the ban would be lifted for 90 days. However, the TikTok has a stupid excuse for not being sold. They're saying that there's nobody in the U.S. that knows how to run it. Absolutely absurd. And then I'm not kidding. This is what they're saying. I don't know much about it, but it's so silly. Silicon Valley and the rest of this country has plenty of people that could run TikTok. And I know that because many of the apps that we already have run the same thing. If you can't tell, I don't care much for TikTok. I think it should have been banned more than 6 years ago, as soon as we realized it was a Chinese app. Speech is not being restricted here. People can literally go somewhere else. Well, government can't control what we say in most circumstances. Government does have a right to say where we can speak. For example, I can't go into a movie theater and start yelling, and then when I'm kicked out, sue and claim that my free speech rights were being violated. Just like I can't go to the Capitol building in D.C. and stage a protest and demand whatever I want, and then claim my rights were violated when security throws me in jail. For me, it's not the content that's being restricted here, it's the location. Really, this whole story for me shows just how feeble our government can be. We take too little action way too late. It's the story of Ukraine, Israel, Afghanistan, COVID, the Chinese spy balloons, and now TikTok. As soon as TikTok was deemed a threat, it should have been banned. And that should have happened in the fall of 2019, which was over 5 years ago. Instead, we let it hang around for several years and collect tens of millions of Americans' data. How pathetic we are, if you ask me. How pathetic. Lastly, I want to end on a more amusing note. The New York Post, which is a right-wing outlet, has reported that Biden believes that Kamala is competent to run again in 2028. Of course, this is not happening. I am 99.9% sure that Kamala will not be the nominee in 2028, considering she did so badly against an unpopular man, Donald Trump. Of course, her popularity could rise, but as of right now, that doesn't seem to be a smart matchup. Usually in politics, once you lose, that's the end of the road. Donald Trump likely only broke the mold because he's a norm buster and a unique political force in his own right, but I don't expect Kamala to be like that. People don't really like Kamala. At least that's not what I saw. And if you do, I would really, I'd love to know why. Because what about her is so energizing? While it's way too early to predict 2028, there is a little bit of polling done by SoCal Strategies, which I'm not sure if they are a reputable source. Their polls didn't have that many. They only had 600 registered likely voters polled, which is usually not. I usually like to see at least 1,000. Shows J.D. Vance leading various Democratic challengers like Josh Shapiro, Gretchen Whitmer, and Governor Gavin Newsom. Harris has a small lead over Vance. I suspect this is because of name recognition. People know who Kamala Harris is. Kamala is a well-known national figure. J.D. Vance is somewhat known, but the others are not very well known and will need to build their national profile if they are going to run for president. However, something I want to note here is both Vance and the various Democrats have relatively low poll ratings, which shows the electorate has not decided on whether Vance or the challengers, whether they would vote for them, which means if Vance wants to be president in 4 years, he should be using his time to build up his profile and the goodwill with the electorate. This means at some point during his presidency, or during Donald Trump's presidency, the attention will need to shift away from Trump and toward him. If or when this will happen, of course, is up in the air. Anyway, that is most of what I have to say for this episode. We will, next week, we are going to mourn or celebrate, depending on your beliefs, the end of the Biden administration. That podcast will almost be exclusively about it and the achievements and failures of Joe Biden as president. It's hard to believe that just a week from now, Trump will return to office once more. I know there's a lot of anxiety and excitement about it, but it will for sure be a wild 4 years. That's all for now. I want to thank you for listening, and I will catch you later. Have a good one. Bye-bye.